This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, so we can start. I was just waiting until the recording began, because last week I thought it started at past, but incidentally it starts at 20 past. Okay, so I want to quickly review a few things from the end of last week. As you all recall, we were ushered quite quickly out. So I'll just quickly call upon last week's end of the lecture slides just to make sure that we haven't missed anything. Obviously, the main topic of today will be input and output. So we'll learn about a few things that are important for your assignments, etc. So I'm struggling here to find. Now, I don't know why, but I'm having a bit of bother with the way PresenterView works, so I will just have to improvise as I go along. Just trying to quickly find out where the lectures. Oh, of course. Yes, now I recall. Yeah, so I pretty much covered almost everything I believe last week that needed to be covered. I'll just call it this. I recall I had an issue, didn't I? So, so this is what we initially covered last week, but I'll just quickly run through to the end where we were discussing the finer points of what we had, what we needed to complete on. I think, was it about here we were, roughly? We'd covered essentially setting up a new Hello World activity within both command prompt or terminal and also in NetBeans. Now, I'm pretty convinced that everyone seemed to be okay with that, I think, if I recall. Essentially, there was nothing we missed out, I think. That's what I'm trying to say. So this week, we'll just start on the input and output, and I'll sort of overview a few of the things that we do need to cover in terms of some of the things that aren't explicitly covered as we go along. So last week we covered Hello World, we covered Java and Javac, and I introduced the term class, right? A file called class. And classes become objects, which we'll cover in more detail further on in the lectures series. I just wanted to highlight the servers issue. Now, I would imagine that most of you, I hope all of you, have been able to access the workshop script on LMS already. Now, the servers aren't set up to accept your submissions yet. There was a delay in the turnover this semester for some reason. So the servers aren't ready to accept your submissions. But you can still continue to sort of learn how to log on, create the Java files, set up your Java environment and the environment variables, etc. And also play with NetBeans or Eclipse or any other IDE that you are happy with. But just wanted you to know that the servers, so if you get an error saying that there's nothing for you to submit when you're trying to submit to get your feedback, that's the reason. So don't be frustrated. Just leave it for now. And I'll send a circular email to everyone as soon as it's live, as soon as it's working. And we hope to get that working very, very quickly. Any questions on that? Anyone have any questions? No? Okay. So today, as I say, we're going to be covering input and output. And I want to sort of focus. Now, most of you have done Python or some other programming language before. I'll still cover these in terms of the context of Java. So we're going to look at the operations and numbers. Okay, I see you don't have what I've got in front of me. You're supposed to see this. Aye. Okay, sorry guys. Let me just try and fix this. I'm so sorry. This is so... What have you got there? Okay, so you've got... Oh, my word. Yes, I'll try and get this up. I'll just get rid of the multi-monitors, I guess. Displays, arrangement. I will just try and mirror the displays. If you don't see what I'm talking about on here, just raise your hand. I will try and look behind myself, but I will likely get carried away knowing me. Let me try that again. Okay. Okay. Aha. This is what I was seeing and looking at, sorry. So I was talking about servers, right? So that was the server issue. Okay. And this is what I was hoping you'd have seen. Okay, good. Phew. So we're talking about operations and number types. So every type last week we spoke about primitive types, the basic nuts and bolts, like the atoms, if you will, of Java. And every type have these operations which can be utilized on those types. And obviously, most of you will be aware of most of these things. If you're not, you may want to read around the subject more. Come and speak to me if you do have any difficulties in this, because I don't want you to fall behind. I know some students weren't following the same stream, so come and see me if that is you. So primitive types, you can utilize the standard things that you'd expect, which is plus, negative. The star, as you would expect, is multiply, division, and then this percentage is a modulo, so the remainder of the division, right? So these, I think, most of you are familiar with. And they can be utilized with any primitive type to manipulate those, add to them and remove from them, etc., as you would expect. So you have these expressions. Again, these are very similar to what you'd normally have in other languages. And what I'll try to do is give examples where it's needed. I won't give too many examples. I've had some people like to have live examples, some people don't. So maybe you can give me, maybe I'll ask a feedback question later on, or early on, should I say, to get the majority of your feelings towards live demonstrations. So you have expressions, and these expressions are put in. So you have a variable. In this example here, you've got a variable called answer. And the equal sign, the single equal sign, means that you're assigning. So it's much with, I think it's the same in C and other languages, but not all, of course. So you're assigning whatever comes to the right. And what's coming to the right in this instance is 2 plus 4 times 7. And then the semicolon, this indicates a break of that actually assignment, so that then you can have the next command at the end of it. It's customary to put the next command on the next line, as you would, but I think the slides are just giving that example to showcase that you can do it. Another way of constructing an expression is to say, for example, if you want to increment a variable, as you've done before, I'm sure, count equals count plus 1. So those are ways of defining expressions or creating different variables and constructing variables using the operations. Then you have these comparisons. So again, very similar to other languages. If you haven't done much coding before, I'll just run through them. So this is less than. So this is a comparison less than or equal to, greater than equal to. This is an equals to in the sense that you're comparing two objects. You're comparing two data types with each other to see whether they're equal to each other. And the, I keep forgetting the name of this, exclamation mark, indicates not, right? So it's not equal to. So you'll use that a lot, especially in Booleans and stuff, and we'll go through those later. So the double equals is a comparison, whilst the equals is an assignment. And I'm sure most of you have, most of you have done these already in Python, perhaps. Or in C or C++. And then you can have Boolean values. So you can set, for example, Dan here, we're expressing a Boolean value by saying it's equal to, and then you give a Boolean expression, which is count greater than or equal to answer. So in this condition, the variable count would be compared whether it was greater or equal to answer, and if it was, the return type would be a Boolean. Therefore, done would actually become a Boolean value, right? So far, so good. Any questions? Nope. Okay. So these are primitive operations. It doesn't hold true to objects. And one of the things that was missing from last week in terms of primitives is the string. So we talked about, you have got, yeah, just a string is an object, and we haven't gone into objects yet, and we will go into objects in a few lectures' time. But for now, we're going to concentrate on the sort of more intricate parts of Java to enable you to utilize those objects when the time comes. So every single type, every primitive type, from all the way from byte up to float, no, double, you can apply these, or you can perform these operations on them. Yeah, that's the first thing to recall. So a Boolean is slightly different in that it has Boolean operators. And Boolean operators, you have the ampersand, which is like the squiggly and. It's called an ampersand. And an ampersand is comparing if two objects together form a truth, similar to a truth table. So you have test1 and test2. If test1 is true and test2 is true, then the return value is true, right? And the same with or. You have test1 or test2. But the key to, the interesting thing about Java here is that you have a double ampersand, right? And a double ampersand is essentially sort of a shortcut, of a short circuit, as it says here, but it's like a shortcut to say, look, if one of these values, it checks only the left value. If the left value doesn't produce the results that is expected, it doesn't check the other value. So it only checks the left only, and then if this fails or doesn't fail, depending on what's required, it then checks the second value. And these are called short circuit operations, and they're usually it's there to sort of streamline or make certain things faster, right? But you can also use a single and a single or operator as well. And these are non-short circuit operators, and this is when you want it to evaluate both sides. Now, often you don't. So when you're trying to evaluate if something is true or if something is false, or if two conditions are true or false, more often than not, if one side fails, you're happy for the whole thing to fail, right? But there are certain conditions where you may want it to check both sides of the logic at the equally, regardless of what the other side does. And such conditions would be, which we will go into later, is when you're sort of calling an object or a function, or sorry, a method in Java. If you call a method and that method returns a Boolean type, but you want it to execute the method regardless of what the return type is, so that some function is taken care of. So you would, in such a case, you would actually utilize a single ampersand and a single or. But generally, for what we're going to be doing for this module, I would urge you just to use the double ampersand and the double or, just for simplicity. But it's good that you know both values just for your knowledge, really. And you will use them in the future, of course, depending on what you need your application to do. But obviously, this is the norm, I would argue, generally. And as I mentioned, what is this symbol called? What was that? Exclamation point or exclamation. I always forget. Like within 2 minutes, I'm like Anyways, I'm like a Dory from Finding Nemo. Okay, so this exclamation is not, right? So you can actually say while a certain condition just not, and it also works as a negation. So when you have a truth, if you have a Boolean that's true, you put the not symbol there. And then it negates that value, often used in various coding techniques. Any questions thus far? No questions? I want you to feel free and comfortable to ask questions, by the way. It doesn't matter what your question is, as long as it's relating to the class, of course. I'll be happy to answer it at any time. Yes, sir? The triple? Triple equal to. I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
So if double equal to signs checks the value is same, triple equal to also checks the data type kind of a
We're not going to be covering anything with triple equals to in the class, only because there are quirks of Java that are utilized in different sort of context. But the rule of thumb here will be, look, single equal is an assignment, double equals is a comparator. And I'll explain more about that. These only work with primitive types as well. So the equal equals only works with primitive types. As I'll explain later when we look at strings, which is on the next, in fact, I'll go to the string slide. A string is an object, and the equal to does not, or it's kind of complicated. It doesn't work on a string because a string is an object. So equals to, when you're comparing a primitive type, it compares two values. The crazy thing, and this is a really weird thing about Java, is that if you do equal to on a string, it will give you a result, but it will not be the result that you're expecting. But to make matters worse, sometimes it will give you the result you're expecting, right? So sometimes it gives you the value, and it's the way that it's utilizing the class hierarchy. Now, we will cover this later on in this module, but for now, we don't use equal to when comparing objects. Instead, we will, is it on the slide? It's not. We'll be using a class type, which I'll show you more about that later. So a string is unique in Java in that it's the only object that is part of the Java structure. You don't have to import or include a string. You can assign a string by simply defining a string, right? Whereas normal objects, you cannot define them by just simply creating an object. What I mean by that is that if I just create a string of letters, like put a quote and something in between, then that becomes an object without creating a new object. Strings are immutable. In other words, what immutable means is that you can't change a string. Once you've created a string, that string is fixed and constant. You can't change that string at all. You may think that you can, because you can modify the string and you can do all sorts of things to the string, but what's actually happening is that Java is recreating a new version of the string, making a copy of it, and removing the old version. And that's useful to know, because if you're trying to make things really fast and you find that things are getting sluggish, that could be part of what's going on. And naturally in this class, we won't be pushing any machine hard enough to even notice a difference in performance anyway. But anyway, but strings are objects. You assign a string in much the same way as you would assign any other primitive, except for you encapsulate it in quotations. So string S is equal to quotation example string, quotation, and then you need the semicolon, of course. And this creates an object of type string. Now, one key norm, differentiator from primitive types to objects is that every object in Java starts with a capital letter. And so objects always have a capital letter, and you must always make your objects, when you create objects, use a capital letter, and make your primitive variables have lowercase beginnings. And that's sort of how we differentiate between them. In a minute, I'll show you the API and how that looks, and that'll give you a little bit of a handle or an understanding as to why we do this. For those who've used Python, you know that you can use a single quote or a double quote to make a string. In Java, you cannot. So a string always has double quotations. If you want to use a single quote as part of your string, as part of your sentence, you can. But if you want to use a double quote, you can't. You have to use a breakout symbol, which is, in this case, the backslash. Oh, sorry. So if you want to, for example, use a quotation inside your string, you have to first put a backslash within the string and then provide the character that you want to showcase. So it's backslash character, then gives the string. And of course, if you want to do a backslash, you have to do backslash, right? So to do a backslash, if you want to do a quote, you do backslash quote, right? So just be aware of that. Then we have these other, so if you put a certain letter, you have a backslash, and then you put a certain letter there. The letter indicates has some meaning that you can utilize to do certain things. Now, you've probably used \n. Can anyone tell me what \n does? New line, right? And then you'll have used \t. Anyone use \t? It is tab. Now, \r. Anyone? Now, this is an interesting one, and I'll tell you why it's interesting, because on some computer systems, \r does what Java says it does. On my system, and maybe on your system, it doesn't. What \r is supposed to do is to return to the beginning. So if you've written like 20 characters of text, and then you do \r, it goes back to the beginning so you can rewrite over those characters. It only seems to work in some output environments. It doesn't work on my system. It used to work on my old university's Linux systems. So I would say be careful on using it, especially if you're going to be going cross-platform. If you're designing something on your machine and it works, and you're designing it for someone else who will use it on another type of machine, I would advocate using some other method or some other means, just because it is a little bit hit and miss. And I forgot what \b does. Can you remind me? \b? Backspace. Goes back one line then. Yes. I've never used it. I've never had to use it. In fact, what will end up happening, and I hope it will happen, is that you'll learn Java in this environment and using the command prompt, but then further on you'll start using Windows and sort of graphical user interfaces, and this all changes, but I'll go into that later. And I'll also discuss the concept and the construct of /n as well. There's two ways of doing the new line, which you'll need to know. So just to recap, classes always have capital letters. So the string class is a class, is an object because it has a capital letter, not because it has a capital letter. It has a capital letter because it's an object. You have the breakout, which is the \. If you put a slash in your code, if you're trying to do a slash, you have to do a double slash. Often when you're reading from files, you know, you have the file system and you have a folder, then you have a slash, and then you have another folder and a slash, and then your file. When you're creating the string for that in Java, sometimes you have to put double slash just to ensure that you have that, and that can be a bit of a problem going between platforms, but we'll look at that as we go along. Any questions? Yes?
Like before using the four icons inside the quotations, we're always putting a backslash like the left side of the core icon. Like they're not inside the two backslash.
No. So it's one \. Yes, good question. So one \/ represents a breakout for that next letter. Whatever's after that is then acted upon. Yeah. So if you just put a single \/ with nothing, it's going to have a little bit of a fit, because it's like, where's my symbol? I want one symbol to tell me what this \/ means. So yeah, good question. So yeah, one \. So in this particular example, \/ here, this one \/ is talking about this quotation. And this \/ here is actually talking about this \/ so that you're getting to see a \/ within that. And of course, is there an output there? I don't see it. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. I know if you're listening, you'll be going out with the headphones. Okay. So yeah, so strings are objects, breakouts are \/, and we need to use those to use quotations. So we have string operations. Now, as I mentioned before, strings are unique in Java in the sense that they can be utilized as objects without having them defined explicitly as an object, because they just are. And in so doing, if you add anything to a string, if you concatenate anything onto a string, the Java tries its best to make that value that you're trying to add to it become part of that string. So, for example, if you printed out hello as a single string between here, and then you added the plus symbol, and then you appended the word world to that, it'll add those two together to create one string, right? So it'll add them together, and it does all that sort of work in the background. As I mentioned, a string is immutable, meaning that Java will actually create a new string for you. And we talk about the garbage collector, and what the garbage collector simply is that Java has a system that simply goes through your code, through memory, finds any objects that you're not able to use again, so if they become dormant or dead and unusable, it then simply removes that memory so that it can be used again. So garbage is anything that isn't usable, gets removed automatically, which is a huge advantage over C in that sense. So the plus symbol is quite clever in the sense that you can add things to strings, but it also has a problem in the sense that it stops you doing mathematical arithmetic within the confines of that string. So, for example, in this example here, you can see that it's adding every value. So A would be 1, B would be 2, and so on. And the output would be A equals the A value, which would be 1, and comma B equals the B value, which would be 2. But in this example here, system.outprint 1 plus 1 equals plus 1 plus 1. You may be forgiven to thinking that this would become a mathematical equation, and then the value would be 2, but the actual output will be 1, 1. And the reason for that is because Java sees the string, sees that you're adding 1 to the string, so adds 1 plus 1 equals the 1, and then has that new string and says, oh, and there's another 1, add that as well. So it just simply adds that to a string. So something to be uniquely aware of. You will have, no doubt, used BODMAS. My daughter said it was called something different here, but in the UK we say BODMAS, which is brackets of division, multiplication, you know this. So it's the order, which we'll go into that in a minute, but it's the order in which you do calculations in mathematics, right? And I'm assuming all of you know this anyway. But it's the same in Java, that you have to utilize brackets. So the way around this, which it's not showing me. There you are. The way around this is to put the 1 plus 1 first in brackets. And what Java does is it does the brackets first. So it identifies and deals with the brackets first. It sees two integers, adds them together, gives you the value 2, then concatenates that to the string. Pretty basic stuff, I guess. I'm assuming. So I'm going to ask any questions, if anyone from of them. Looking at the time, I'm going to be finishing early a bit today, by the way. I don't want to have a rerun of last week. So I'll be finishing at 4, just so you know, and then running out the door quickly. Dear me. Where was I? Okay. So with that. The string, being an object, the string has a multitude of available commands in the library for you to utilize. And what I'm going to do, I'll discuss this first, and then I'll show you how to access the library and how complicated it can be. But it becomes easy once you practice. What happens is when you define a string, you give it a variable name. That variable name becomes an object of type string. Objects of types, any object, have inherent methods that are built into all objects. I'll go into the hierarchical nature of objects in a later lecture, but so the object means that you can utilize things such as length and to uppercase and substring. How it works is you take the object, in this case say S becomes the object of type string, and you simply use a dot. When you have the object, any object that you have, the variable name, you put the variable name in, and then you put the dots there. And the dot signifies that you're going to be using a method that's available to that object. All objects have certain types of built-in methods that you will always be able to use. Many methods you will create yourself, and we'll go into all those at a later date. But type length will obviously give you, what do you suppose? The length of the string, right? So it'll give you the length of the string. To uppercase, what do you suppose to uppercase will do? It'll convert everything to uppercase, right? The substring does exactly what you might think. So it takes the first value of I and the last value of j and gives you a substring of that value. But, and this is the same in Python, so anyone who's done Python will feel familiar with what I'm about to say. Anyone who hasn't or hasn't done any language won't. The values, the first value here, like any combination of data values in a list, often called an array, it always begins with 0. So the first value is 0, and the last value is the nth value minus 1, right? So this one would go from the second value of, say, for example, smile. So it will move the cursor. Now, you know the cursor is that little flashing line that you may see. Oh, this one's a square. Oh, my gosh. Can you see that? Yeah, this one, okay, it's not flashing, but sometimes that little square flashes as a single line. That's called a cursor, obviously. So what you do is you count the number of cursors. So 1 goes to here, so you skip 0 goes to 1. So you start from here, and then you count up to 5. In this case, would stop. So it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it's between the two values. So it's between the first value and the last value that you take that chunk of code. So just remember that. So basically, it's 1 minus the value that you've given in essence. And in this instance, it would take back the word mile. And as I mentioned, the double equals does not work on objects. We will go into this a little bit more detail later when we start creating our own objects. But there is a command called equals. So the object dot equals, and then you supply what you're trying to compare into it as brackets, and that will then compare them to the two values to compare the strings. If you don't do that, it does, sometimes you'll get the right answer, most of the time you won't, but you're not doing what you think it does. And I won't go into the details of why right now, but we will explore that later as well. The index of obviously returns the first instance, the very first instance, going from left to right, of an instance of that subgroup. So if you're looking for L, for example, in smiles, it would give you 0, 1, 2, and 3 in terms of searching for L within that string. You don't use these values. It will give you, it won't complain, it will just give you the wrong value, so just remember that. Let me just quickly, I don't know if I can, will it? Oh no, it won't let me. So, ooh, I want to quickly show you. So Java has this concept that you need to become quite familiar with called the Java API. Now, if you Google the Java API, so what I've done is I've simply put in that's what you first saw on this string here. Or you can just type in Google Java API 8. We're going to be using 8 for this. Even if there's a new version that comes out during lectures, I always do the one before because it ends up causing too many headaches. So what you can or can't see there, this is the Java doc. You can create these yourself. And a Java doc is essentially a list of every single library command that's available to you. So if I just search for string, and start running down the strings until we see just the word string. So this now, here, I'm going to click, I know that's not very big, but I'm going to click on the word string here, and then that's going to open up what's available to the string object. And let me get rid of the yellow. I'm trying to make this a bit bigger. So what the string object, I'll go into the details of what these mean later. But for now, I just want to show you some of the commands. If you scroll down all the writing, eventually you'll have a table of stuff that are available to you and how they work. But, oh my gosh. Oh, okay, so here we go. So this is like, for example, index of. So one of the commands I was mentioning was the index of. You can click on index of, and it will show you what index of is. It also shows you a list of loads of other commands, as you can see, that are available to the string object. And you yourselves will be making your own Java doc, hopefully, and utilizing tons and tons of these things as well. So it's a very mature language now, in fact. You had the to uppercase, you've also got the to lowercase. We will be covering the to string. I won't go into that right now, but we will cover that. And you can see, so there's a list. So if you want to know what is available, you basically go to the API. The API will become your sort of friend. You'll utilize new objects in your own code, and if you want to know how they work, you go to the API, you look it up, see what it does, and take it from there. So get used to looking, I know this is blurring, really blurry, I'm trying to get back to where we were at the bottom. Oh my gosh. Holy cow. Anyway, you can see what I mean. There's a whole host of commands available to you. And at the top, generally, it does tell you where it comes from. So everything's stored in certain folders. This one's stored in the Java lang object folder. I'll go into that with you later. What I'm going to do right now, I think, I will. Oh my gosh, there you go. Let's have a quick 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes. I'm just looking at the time because I know we have to manage that in as well. So let's have a 5-minute break, and we'll carry on in a moment.
Actually wanted to talk about the semester one's Python assignment. Do you remember I sent you so many emails?
Okay, I vaguely remember, yes, go on.
Yeah.
It's probably not the time right now, but
Do you have time, like,
after the lecture, no, but tomorrow I'll be after my morning lecture, so roughly between 11 to 12, I've got some time tomorrow.
at your office?
Yes, yeah, no worries. Yeah, what was it about?
So I have my assignment to review iCloud application.
Oh, okay. So it's just about the marks. Yeah. We'll discuss that after. Awesome. Yeah, I think so. Oh, okay. So, yeah, all of us try to add the mathematical equation expression. You can just add it to the values so the brackets will then look at the maths, or some of that, and add that to it. And you don't. Okay, so the server's not running, it's not, it's absolutely not okay, so you're trying to use the server as I can't do anything about that right now. I'm trying Okay. Hello. Yep. So we'll just carry on. So as we should already know from Python, that you have this special assignment operators, such as if you want to accumulate or add up a given value over and over again to a single variable, you can simply, if you wanted to say x equals x plus 1, you can use the special assignment form, which you've used again in other languages, which is plus equals 1. Or this works on all the operators, so you can have times equals and minus equals, division equals and modulo equals, and they do as you would expect. So they simply take the original value, assign the incremental value to the original value, and return the new value, so that the variable becomes that variable, if that makes sense. So pretty, yeah, you have got it on there. So pretty straightforward. So, for example, if you had a string called message or MSG is equal to hello, and then you said MSG plus equals the new message word, it then concatenates or adds to that, takes the original string, adds the new string to the end of it, and provides the new value for you to work on. So it's what, as you would expect, quite pretty straightforward, I think. Now, there is a concept called pre- and post-incremental and decremental functions, and this is something to be kind of aware of, but I will give you some tips as how not to fall into this dungeon, if you will. So when you use, so if you go back to here, where you use plus equals, there is another way that you can say, look, if you just want to increment by 1, so if you just want to count by 1 value, you simply say plus plus variable name, or negative variable name. And that's called pre-increment or pre-decrement. And it's a bit, it's an oddity that you can also have what's called a post-increment, and they're uniquely different. If you use them as counters, they work exactly the same. So post-increment and pre-increment and decrement works exactly the same way if you're just using them to count. But if you use them as an assignment, then they're very, very different in the way that they actually present the results. So one is that it returns the value and then assigns the change, and the other one is that it assigns the change, then gives you the value. Sounds very subtle, and it is kind of subtle. But the reality is that depending on how you utilize this function or this feature, will actually affect your results. So I want you to be aware of it. I would advocate and advise that you should always just use this as a counter, just so that you don't get caught up in the pre and post increment and decrement. But on saying that, just to make sure to help you recognize the difference, we'll do a quick quiz. You know, the quick quiz is so we if you go to the if you go to, so it's quick poll, QP, hang on. Oh my gosh. So it's this, oh my gosh, this website here, QP, unimelb.edu.au/TCHRISTY. Use your phone, use your mobile, use your iPad, use your laptop, anything that connects to the internet. And then we have a situation where we have x is equal to 10, y is equal to 5, and then we're going to say, look, print out x plus plus minus plus plus y. Okay, so essentially what's happening is we're having a pre-increment and a pre-decrement, and we're taking the one and minusing the other. So the question is it 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, you think, based? I'll give you a few minutes. Is everyone done? Okay? Everyone happy? Everyone voted? Oh. Oh my gosh. Hang on. Ay. There we are. So majority say B. Why B? Because you've probably got the slides in front of you, right? Hands up, who's got the slides? Okay, so the answer is B, and what happens is that you, essentially you have x++ increments, I forget which way, it takes 10, increments, doesn't increment, it does the value between 5, which is plus y, which is 6, so it says 10 minus 6 equals 4. And the reason for that is that 10 doesn't return the decremented value because it's post increment, sorry. This one pre-increment, so this one does return the value before it's assessed, and then the assessment is done, which gives you the value. So if you did say B, you were correct. Yeah, it's a crazy sort of execution of something we barely use. And in fact, in my working profession, I barely ever use this other than to increment a value. So I would advocate you do the same. Okay, so that's just reviewing what we just said. So then you have these built-in type conversions. So primitive operations, they have these. You can expand a type conversion. If you have an int and you manipulate that int with, say, a float or a double, then Java will actually take the two values and take the higher value. So, for example, if you had a float and you added it with a double, it will convert both the return values to a double. So, so it widens the conversion. It can do that quite easily. And that's an automatic thing it does, including if you have a char. Now, if you remember, the type char was a single character from a string, and it's identified by having a single quotation. So that would be converted to an int or a long or a float. It would be back to its sort of primitive type, or it is a primitive type, but it would be converted back to one of the other widening values. So essentially, bytes will be converted to shorts, bytes will be converted to ints. What I'm saying is, if you have two values of different types, the wider value, the one with the more sort of bytes and the bigger value, it will be converted to that. So if you take an integer and you multiply that by a double, the return value will be a double. But that's not to say that if you, for example, if you take two integers, divide them together, and then store that into a double, you'll still get the mathematical equation, like you would have in Python, would actually be calculated before the conversion. So you'd have a conversion of two integers, and then it would be stored as a double. So even though you'd have a double value stored, the actual accuracy of that would be from two integers. We'll look at that inside the tutorial so that you'll be playing with those values. Excuse me. Oh. I don't know if that comes off really bad on the line. Excuse me. Any questions on that? All good? So that was called widening. So if you have a value and you compare two primitive types, or sorry, not two different primitive types, if you multiply or calculate those together, do any kind of mathematical equations on two primitive types, it's called widening, and the wider type will come out true. But narrowing conversions are also possible, but you have to be very explicit. Yeah, explicit. And use this term which you will have used before called casting. And casting simply says that you take one value and you force it to become another value. So you have a type of, say, double, and you want it to become an int, so you will cast it as an int. Essentially, so if you have, the casting is done by putting a bracketed data type before a variable. So you've got a variable called sum here, and because it has this bracketed double, which is the type, before it, sum becomes double. And of course, even though count is an integer, it then both values here are then classed as doubles because of the previous slide. So because if you have a double and an integer, both will be a double. And this is the same, you're forcing sum, or one of them, to be a double, therefore both become a double. And then the returned average will be the product of this calculation here. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yes?
If I use this bracketed,
That's okay.
if I do this, after I did that, if I use the sum or count again, that will be an integer.
That's a good question, yes. So the question is if by casting sum and count, does it change the original type? Is that paraphrasing the question? So the original types remain the same. You're not actually changing them. You're simply using the product of that calculation and assigning a cast to. So what you're doing in this case, so this sum will always still be an int. So it's a good question. Count will still always be an int, because once you typecast a variable, you can't change that unless you really specifically want to change it. So in this case, sum is still an int, count is still an int, but the product becomes, the calculation becomes a double, and the product that's passed on to average becomes a double too. But it remains an integer. So it's a very good question. Yeah. Any other questions? No. So yes.
In case that I'm going to be casting it's going to say sum is some point my count is going to drop into a float number. It's going to be cast into a float number.
So could you rephrase the question?
It says sum equals 3 and count equals 2.
Yeah.
And 3 divided by 2 is equal to a half.
Right, okay. So if you were to do that without the double or without casting it, and just have two integers, it will act upon an integer and usually should round it off. Unless Java's, I mean, they do try to change these things in more updated versions, but generally the expectation is that it will round off the value to an integer because you're working on integers, right? But then it would never go to a float if it's a double, because they're two different types. I know in some languages they're kind of, you can intermix them, but so in this case the double simply forces one of these values, sum, to become a double, and therefore incorporates the type conversion which is built in. So that allows it to actually become a double overall. The calculation becomes a double. If that double wasn't there and you try to store it in average, average would actually have a double value, but it would be inaccurate because the actual product of two integers would have been rounded off first before storing it. Yeah? Good question. Yes? I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but
I'm not sure if the sum and count, let's see, in sum and in count, well, they'll only become double type when we're doing
yes. So you're not actually converting them to doubles. You're simply converting the calculation to a double calculation. Yes. Thank you. So this is just going through the precedence of an associativity. So this is talking about BODMAS and how multiplication comes first. It's standard sort of, I guess, high school sort of mathematics. Just understand that brackets, if you want to be specific with any value, your brackets is first. Otherwise, the calculation will be, could be different. If the calculation that you're producing isn't very specific and isn't clear, so you don't have brackets and you don't have any order in terms of the calculation you're creating, then it won't be clear to others who are reading it as well. So be very specific with your calculations, so specifically if you've got a task to do and you want to have the correct outputs. Just remember that the precedence, that what comes first has meaning. I have a table coming up that will show you what is more important and what is less important. Or maybe important is not the right word, but which comes first, which is acted upon first. But again, when in doubt, just put in parentheses, just put brackets in if you have any doubts as to which order the things are going to be evaluated. So this is the high to low precedence. So the first thing that's acted upon is the dots. Now, we haven't covered what the dot actually refers to properly yet, but we will. But just understand that if there's a dot after your object, then the dot is indicated first. Then it's the plus, plus, negative, negative. Then it's a negative value, so if you're saying negative A or negative sum. Then typecasting, then these three are the same, so the order of these, if you have three of them in a line, then it's just going to be potluck, I guess, left to right, perhaps. Plus, negative, then you've got the comparisons, less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. Then equal equals or not equal to, and, or, and then, oh, that's supposed to be a double equals as well. Equal, equal, plus equal, and times equals. So that's the kind of expectation. So you have an idea. You'll obviously have to refer to this when you're working, just if you do get results that you're not expecting. But that's pretty straightforward, really, in that sense. So now we're going to turn our attention to formatted outputs. Now, last week we kind of covered the hello world, and we looked at a function called, a method called println, print line. Now, Java also has printf, which is taken from C. So if you're familiar with C, you can just go to sleep for a bit, because this is exactly the same. It's stolen from C. If you've not done C, then you've done other languages. Printf is what you would expect. It's print format. So what you're doing is you're specifying a particular format of a string and adding variables to that formatted string in order. So essentially you'll have the formatted string, and for every breakout or percentage, which is the breakout term, which I think I forget already if it's the same in other languages. For every one of these, in turn, it takes an argument, and the argument steps. If you have 10 of these, you have to have 10 arguments, and that's pretty much the basics of it. So the percentage expects the percentage symbol, and followed the percentage symbol, it requires a letter. The letter denotes what type of data type will be provided. And like other languages, the first number indicates how many characters are assigned to, the minimum characters are assigned to the actual value. And if it's, say, for example, a float, then you have the decimal, and the second, so the point refers to the next value. So this particular one will have the average of 5 significant numbers, point, and then 2 decimal numbers, right? Obviously the F means float in this case. It also means double. So in Java, it's double and float, because because integers. What would you suppose? It's not on there. What would you suppose an integer might be? The symbol. So you have for example, a character is a C, a string is an S, right? A float is an F. What might an integer be? It is D, for those that have obviously read it, but you would expect it to be an I, right? But it's not. It's a D for digits. I didn't make this up. So, yeah. So we have the format. I've got a table of all the format specifiers coming up. Let me just double check that I do. Yes, I do. So, in much the same as any other language, you have your string then you have the percentage, which indicates that you're going to put in a formatted element or argument. You put some values in there if they have values. I'll show you what they have later. And then you put the symbol defining the data type. If you mix them up, if you give the wrong data type, you will have an error, so it will crash. It won't try and fix it for you. And that's pretty much the basics of formatted. Now, this isn't my preferred method. I tend to use an object to create functions, to create formatted strings. And I'll explain more about that later. And the reason why I do that is because often, when you do code, often you don't code to the command prompt. Very rarely, in industry, very rarely will you really code just to the terminal or to the command prompt or to the output prompt. You'll often code to whichever user interface is being provided as an interface, right? So whatever that is, you'll code to that. So I'll explain that later. But for now, this is the basics of it. So whatever when you're using a function, you can put optional numbers within the percentage and the f. Again, if you've done Python or C, this will be familiar to you. So it's pretty basic stuff. If you haven't, it's just a case of, we'll have some examples, I guess. But it's the minimum number. So if you have a percentage, you have 5, and then you have f, you don't have to have the decimal. Even if you have, say if you put D there, then instead of percentage, percentage 5 and D, it does the minimum. So if you give it like 6 integers, it will do all 6, right? But if you give it 3 integers, it'll give the space for 5, if that makes sense. You will get time to play with this. If you have a negative value, then the standard procedure is that it justifies the case to the left justification. If you put a negative 5 there, it'll right justify. So if you just give it the value 2 and you've got negative 5, it'll do 5 spaces and right justify. The opposite justify to normal. Yeah. So that's negative. And of course, you don't have to have decimals. If you put a decimal place in, for example, an integer or a character, you will get an error. So it's pretty straightforward stuff. And like I said, because you've done the prerequisites, this kind of stuff is pretty straightforward. But of course, you will need to get familiar with this. You will have to learn this because it is obviously a type of thing that is examinable, so be aware. So get yourself really familiar with this kind of thing. So these are the format letters. So you have D, which has no fractional part, which is an integer, not I, D. S, again, no fractional part, so you wouldn't put decimal there. And C, character. So character is, again, signified by quotation. The thing to remember about the character is if you put a percentage C, and then provide the argument of a character, if you give it an integer value, so for example, I think I could probably showcase, will it work? No. Can you see that? Is it big enough? Nope. Can you? Aha. So if you were to say, printf like this, and you were to say this is the, and then you say percentage C, like this, and then you give it the argument, which this case, if you were to give it, say, a value, an integer value, it does cast that into the value that you have. Because you remember that a character is a single symbol from an ASCII table. An ASCII table is just basically a grid showing all the characters that are available to your keyboard. Whereas if I was to run this, the output is a capital A. So even though I've given the value 65, just experiences that 65 is actually the ASCII table character A. So just something to be, oh my gosh, what have I done? There you go. So even though, so if you have a character, you don't have to give an ASCII character with a single quote, sorry, not double, single quote. You can give an integer value as well, which it will convert. Float is both a float or a double, so you can give both float or double value there. E gives the exponential notation, and G does the same. We won't be using these in this module anyway. If you want to have a percentage sign, you have to do percentage, because why not? And then also, this is there's a distinct difference between /n, so you've got \n, \n, to do a carriage return. Or you can do, when you're doing printf, you can use %n as well, which does the same, kind of gives the same output, but there is a distinct difference in the way that it works, because if you're using a Unix system, it will give the same symbol. If you're using different symbols like old DOS or Windows, it can be different as well. The difference is that, excuse me, I've got a cough again. Sorry. The difference is that /n works in all print formats. %n works in just, like println or print or whatever. %n generally is reserved for printf or very specific machines. So there's a slight distinct difference. For all intensive purposes, we'll just be using \n, so you won't really need to use %n, but it is there for you to use as needed. Any questions? I'll just move on otherwise, just because I know most of you will have covered this anyway. Any questions? No? All easy stuff, eh? So here's an example just showcasing the basics of that. So you have, remember I said that these were just a template or a boilerplate, so we'll cover those in a later class. We'll cover this in a later class. So you've got a string of S, which has the word string, a double of pi, which has this value here, and then you have these different percentages a breakout symbol. So you have the first one is an S, so the breakout is an S, which it looks for the string S. The second one is a digit, so it's looking for, if you remember, we have the length, which is a function of the class object string. So it's taking S and the length of, providing that for the digit. And then we have this new line, which makes it into a new line, which you could also use /n, of course. Anyway, the output is what's important, right? So you have one thing to be noted is that it doesn't just truncate. So you have this double pi here. It doesn't just chop it off. It actually rounds it up or down to the nearest value. That's something to be aware of. And then the justification, you've got the -9 here with the 4 values behind it, and then the positive. Negative, where's the, it is the positive one. It's the positive and the negative. So one's left justified and one's right justified. You will be playing with this as part of your workshops. So that's pretty much straightforward stuff. So a quick poll again. Before you do, though, before you vote, let me just reset. Okay, so the poll question is, how many characters appear before the decimal point in the number x printed with printf %6.2f? So place your bets. You all have a link to the thing, don't you? The QP, quickpoll.unimelb.edu.au/T Christie. Everyone happy? Everyone voted? Okay, so that's interesting. That is interesting. So, now, most of you say D. Oops. Let me just update to see if there's any more coming in. Yeah, there's more coming in. Okay, so most of you say D. Why D? Anyone want to throw out YD? Okay, so the reason I ask YD is because the real answer is I don't know. Because we don't know the value of x. And because we don't know the value of x, even though the 6 is indicating 6 units, if the value of x was like 10 billion, 0.348, you would have this huge number first. It wouldn't take into account, it wouldn't truncate the main value. It would just extend the main value. So the truth is we don't know. So I was expecting everyone to say A, I guess. Okay, so just be aware of that even though you're stating a given size, it doesn't cut it off. And because I didn't give you the value of x, you didn't know how big x would be, therefore you didn't really know how big the value would be. Does that make sense? So the value is I don't know. Okay, so so I've got about 30 minutes left. Okay, so one of the things that you've seen a lot of, and I'll showcase it to you in the code. If you remember, how do I make this bigger? Oh, wee. Okay. Okay. So I want to highlight, or I'll get rid of this for now. I want to highlight this section of the code. There you go. So this is the main method, as we discussed. Every single project has to have one main method, and that's how you run your code. But in between, so when you call the method main, it has this thing here, this little piece of code here, and what that is a variable called args of type array string, right? So anyone who's done Python will recognize, or C will recognize, that this symbol here represents an array, right? An array is simply a given variable, whether it's an integer, a string, or any other variable, and you have the same variable over and over again up until a given size, right? So what this is this string args, what this particular string does is that the word argument, ARGS, is whatever input is presented to the main method at launch. Now, I won't do it in the IDE here, but if I go to here, the command prompt, if you remember, when you call a Java program, you call the word Java, and then you type in, after you've compiled it, if you recall from last week, you sort of type in the name of the class, hello, right? And then what it's expecting is, after that, if I press a space and I type in Thomas, Christy, like this, what these become, any values after the running become the arguments that are passed into the main method, right? So in this particular example, if I ran that, there is this particular hello, so this hello class here, doesn't actually have any values of args that I'm working on. But if you write a program like, let me show, do we have an example? We do have an example. So if any program that you write, this value becomes arg0, this value becomes arg1, this becomes arg2, this becomes arg3, and so on, right? So however many arguments that you put into your code at launch will be passed into this variable here. And this variable can take as many arguments as you provide, and you can act upon those arguments during runtime. So often you might have a username and password. So you might have your code, your program will not launch unless you give the username and a password, or maybe just a username, and then it asks for the password because it recognizes the username, if that makes sense. So going back to the slides, so that boilerplate, that public static void main string arguments, square brackets, this is why you use the square brackets. And the reason this is important to you is because when you submit most of your assessed work, this is what you will be expected to do, right? You will be expected to utilize the arguments. So I would advise that you get used to using the terminal just for executing your code. You don't have to use it for developing, because I understand the IDE really helps and speeds things up and makes things easy for you to learn. So I would always promote to use the IDE. But when you're submitting or preparing to submit your work, test your code on the command prompt using arguments in the same way as I've just explained. So this allows you to give information to the program, and then you can act upon that information as you need to. And the thing to remember is that every single value, even though when I put in the word Thomas, the word Christie, this and this, I've just put in the words, right? I've not put quotes at either side of them. But Java takes them in, as it does with most inputs, as strings. So it's expecting them to be a string. Even if you give it a number, it still casts that as a string, so you have to cast it back to an integer if you're expecting an integer. Does that make sense? So we will go into more detail about this later, but that's something to be acutely aware of. So this is the example given. Looks different on your screen. So it's taking in, it has the basic hello world. It says system printout dot hello and the arguments, and then it provides, when you run it, you type in Java, you type in hello2, which is the name of the class. This particular example is Peter. Then it says hello Peter, so hello space plus the Peter that's just come through. Now, a key to remember is if you then run that code, so if this code was then run and you didn't provide the argument, I won't go into this now, but you'll have this type of error, which is array out of bounds exception, because the essential nuts and bolts is because it's expecting an argument and you've not provided an argument, right? So your job will be to ensure that you're checking that an argument is there or not before you act upon that. Does that make sense? Any questions? No? Okay. Just keeping an acute eye on the time so I can run out the door. Okay, so again, you can, if you wanted to take an integer, as I mentioned, so if you want to take in a number from the command line, the way to do that would be to use so every primitive type, int, float, double, they have an equivalent object within Java. And so the integer has an equivalent integer class called integer. And integer allows you to have many different functions available to it. So if you remember the API and the list of all those commands that you had for the string, integer has the same. So it has the integer class, and it has a list of a load of different commands that are available to integer. One of those commands is parseInt, which simply says, take in a string and try and convert it to an integer and store it as return it as an integer primitive type. So if you do provide a number to the command prompt, then you'll have to parse it using the int parseInt if it's an integer, or double parse double if it's a double. We'll look at those more in the workshops. And of course, and only then can you manipulate it. So once that value has been converted to an integer, can you then multiply it with whatever value or do whatever mathematical equation you want to do with it. Make sense so far? Yeah, pretty easy? Okay, so the next thing is the scanner class. Now, I had a question of this over the weekend. Excuse me. I get a dry throat. I get a dry throat when I talk, so I end up having to cough a lot. So I haven't got a cold. I hope I haven't anyway. So when you have used Python or such, or even C, it's pretty straightforward to pull in an input off the keyboard. It's like a basic, very small command. I think, but in Java, it's not as easy as that. So the first thing you have to do, Java, the primitive Java, the basic vanilla Java, doesn't have a keyboard input reader built into the standard rendition as you would expect. So what you have to do is you have to use this command called import. Now, if you remember, I forget what it's called. Is it include? I've been doing a lot of C. What's it called in Python when you import a library? include? No? Somebody shout it out? No? Huh? You still use imports in Python? Oh, okay, I forget. I'm doing a lot of work with C in another class, and I'm getting all scrambled. So in Java, you use the term imports to call in extra commands that you want to utilize. And you've done this in other languages, so it should be familiar to you. And one of those things that you have to call in is the scanner class. Now, if you're working from an IDE, generally the IDE, if I call the IDE and I just type in scanner, just call it input equals new. Right? Oh, my word. Okay, so it's saying that it can't, right, if I right click and I say fix imports, it asks me which import I want. I click OK, now it's imported, so you can see now it's got the right place. So if you don't know, on an IDE, you can have it automatically provide the import for you. If you haven't got an IDE, if you're using a word processor, or not word processor, a Word type document editor or whatever, you will need to quickly check the, oh my gosh. Hello? What have I just done, guys? Oh my gosh, get rid of that. Okay, what am I looking for? I'm looking for, okay, it's not giving it to me. Okay, so you will have to go into the IDE, search scanner, and the scanner will tell you what you need to import. That's what I was trying to show you. So you can see that this has been imported automatically, something to be aware of. And then to utilize the scanner, you use this. So you have to create you've basically imported the scanner class so that it knows where to find the information. Then you have to create a new object of type scanner. Now, something to be aware of, you should only utilize one scanner per, let's just use the word project. I'll go into more detail later, but don't create multiple scanners. So when you create a scanner, in this case it's called keyboard. In my case here, I called it inputs. You can call it anything you want. This is creating a new object here. You only want to create one per project, okay? Don't use more than one, because it starts to play really weird. It acts really weird, and you won't get the results that you're looking for. So once you've created the new object, you can then use the keyboard object that you've created. So this is a variable of type scanner that has got a brand new implementation of the scanner class. What does that mean? It means that everything that a scanner has, you can now use under the name of keyboard. And then you're calling keyboard here, and you're calling keyboard here, and you're using, in this particular instance, next line, which is a method within the scanner class, and you're storing that next line, whatever the line coming in from the keyboard, you're storing it in a variable called line, which is of type string. Right? So that's pretty much the basics. You import the scanner class, you create a scanner object, and then you utilize, every time you can use this line over and over again, but you only use this line once. Okay? So you make this line once, and this line you use every time you want to take input from the user's keyboard. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yes? Yes. No. So, yeah, the question being, like, so you obviously know Java quite well. When you're importing values, at the moment, I'm importing Java util scanner. You could put an asterisk there, which would say, look, everything in the utility, import all of them. It's what you will end up doing, but for this class, I'd recommend being very specific with each import so that you learn which imports are important for the task, yeah? Even though this is possible, it wouldn't affect the assignment. It doesn't make a difference. We don't check the import, we check the functionality. So if it functions, even if you've got like a billion lines of code, even if we find the one code that does what you need it to do, you still get your marks. So that's okay. But so for the purpose of this class, we'll keep all the imports specific to what we need, just so that we learn. But you're right, absolutely right. When you're doing your professional work, you end up cutting corners everywhere. It's very normal. So that's perfectly fine. The scanner, generally, the basics, these are some of the basics that the scanner has available to you. So if you want one word, you can use the term next, which will basically take each word within the string in turn for each call of next. If you want an integer, you call in keyboard next int. If you want a double, keyboard next double. This word keyboard is your variable name, right? So if you call it Bob or if you call it a bottle of water, then that's what you use. It's the variable name that you supply for the object. So the next simply looks for white space. It looks for spaces and takes words in turn depending on what's available. New line, so the one here, where was it? Next line takes the entire line and as a whole string, and often that's what you want to use. If you do next and just take the next word, sometimes you can get confused over which word is in the buffer, so you'll end up making a mess of what you're trying to read. But you'll be able to play with this. So play with it, try and break it, try and fix it, try and break it, try and fix it, and just get used to seeing error codes and seeing how it performs generally. So if you provide the wrong type, so if you write the term nine, N-I-N-E, and you provide it as a next int, it will give you an error because it can't find the symbol 9, right? So it needs the symbol 9 to be able to do a casting. So yeah, here's a quick example as I've just shown you on here. So this is the scanner. So if I wanted to say string my text equals, what did I call it? Input. Oh my gosh. Input dot. And then another thing with an IDE, it gives you, when you've got an object and you press the dot key, it provides a list of all the methods and information about those methods to you, right? So you won't know what most of these will do, obviously. I mean, nobody expects you to know what all of these do. But you can see the one that you want, and then you can call upon that for now, and then you can explore and increase your sort of vocabulary, if I can use that term, or a list of commands that you're familiar with and you use, and this is normal, you will do this a lot. So this is just simply doing what I've just done there. So you're taking a variable from, this one's taking a variable from the input parameters, storing it as num1. It's then taking a variable from the scanner, so it's opening a scanner, prompting, there's something to be aware of. The scanner doesn't say anything. So if I open a scanner, so if I go back to here, if I run this code now, which I will, and I just type in my text like this. So if I run this code, what will happen? Nothing. And why nothing's happening? It is doing exactly what I've asked it to do. It just hasn't said anything because I haven't told it to say anything. So if I just type in my name, it prints out my name. And the reason it wasn't doing anything is because I haven't told it to. What's happened is it's created a new object called scanner. It's then asked for an input off the command line, but it hasn't said anything. It hasn't stated anything. So you're responsible for saying things like, please enter your name, like so. So you're responsible for prompting the user, okay? So if I run that now, you can see now it's saying, please enter your name. Oh, actually, it's asking for the input here. Another thing, I may as well just show you. Okay, so it's asking for the input here, and that's why print ln isn't what you want for a scanner either. You want to use print, which prints waits at the end of the line here. Oh, for Thomas. Make sense? Any questions? Okay, just keeping an eye on that time. We've all got to be out really quick. So this is just giving an example of that, and this one in particular is taking an integer and it's acting upon that integer with this calculation here. So I'll let you review that as online or whatever, so that's no big deal. Excuse me. See, I have a coffee. So sorry, it doesn't help, does it? Sorry, online. So play around. I want you to play around with next int, next line, next double. Play around with these and see how they perform. You'll find that depending on how you perform next and next line can actually throw away some information. You don't want to lose information, so you want to be very careful how you utilize the taking in of the data. I'll let you play with that and review that as needed. But this is what you're going to be doing over the next few weeks anyway. Yeah, essentially if you read a next word and then a white space, or next line and expect to get another word, you take one word. You can lose information depending on which order that you take in the information from the keyboard. Again, play with it, see how you get on, and hopefully it makes sense, but bring questions to the lectures as needed. So, another quick poll. Oh, before you do, let me just, new poll. So let's get as many as you can, so if you could, humour me. Everyone go on to quick poll, qp.unimel. Hang on. Oh my gosh. So it's, oh my gosh, sorry about this. quickpoll.unimel.edu.au/t. So go to that website there. Okay, and answer the question. That's not a question, is it? Yes, it is. It's only 3, so I can see what's coming. Oh, I just showed you the answer anyway. All right, so what's happening is you're creating a new object scanner. You're taking in the next int, you're taking in the next line, you're taking in the next line. You're providing on each one of these 1, +2, +3, and it was asking what the output would be. So some of you may have already done stuff on there. You have, so most of you said B, and it was in fact B. The reason for that is simple, that your S1 is becoming the nothing because it's taking an int, you're taking one value next to. Look into that anyway, we'll come back to that. I'm actually getting rather nervous at the time, so I'm looking at the doors. If you were here last week, you'd understand. You might be able to hear it on the lecture slides, on the lecture capture at the end, but I won't go into that any more than needs be. So just remember, a scanner reads chunks at a time, holds on to the value until it's requested. You don't create multiple scanners, just to create one scanner. Otherwise, and depending on how you read from the input, you'll get your inputs in different orders. So just use one scanner, don't use 2 scanners. Some examples here. So yeah, this is showing 2 scanners and kind of going through the different inputs. So if you create 2 scanners, you can do it. It's not going to give you an error, but it is going to give you different return values. Again, play with this. Go on your IDE, start practicing. Any questions, bring them to the tutorials and discuss those with the tutors. And if you don't get the answers, bring them to me, come to the class, ask the questions. Now, can I have a quick show of hands before we close? How many of you have actually scheduled to go on a workshop? Hands up who has. Is everyone scheduled to go on a workshop? Big bright hands up if you have. No? Okay, not that many. Hands up who hasn't then. Hands up who isn't registered to a workshop. Okay, so some of you don't know. The reason I ask is because for some reason 2 workshops have fallen off the timetable. I don't know why. They're scheduled on my system as 2 workshops. One was this morning, early morning this morning. Was anybody on the 8 o'clock one this morning? Nobody? Okay, so there was, on my schedule, there has an 8 o'clock one this morning and there's another one in midweek, and they've fallen off. And I was just going to double check that there wasn't an issue in terms of you not getting the workshops that you want. Remember that with the workshops, if you can't make one workshop, by all means attempt to go to another workshop, but do ask the tutor first if there's room. Those that have been assigned onto the workshop should get priority. If there is room for you, by all means join any workshop that is convenient to you. And then just a quick summary, you use the plus to append to strings. Plus converts one operand to a string if the other is a string. Printf this formatted output. We will look at other formatting structures later on. args brings in values from the launch. Use Java scanner to read from the console, and don't use multiple scanners. And I will see you guys next week. I know it's a bit early, but I want to pack up and run out the door. Any questions before I go? No questions? Sorry, do you want to